Tonight's lecture, You Got Me Burning Up, Recent Work, with Chicago-based artist Regin Igloria, is scheduled in tandem with his current exhibition, Seven Skins, at the Glass Curtain Gallery on the first floor. Through the lens of dry absurdity, Regin Igloria explores diverse topics such as survival, competition, and the Western iconography of the outdoorsman. Tonight, Igloria will discuss his latest explorations in navigating with digital and painted works, and its relationship to the book form to create a literal figure-ground relationship for the viewer. Born in 1974 in Manila, Philippines, Igloria is a multidisciplinary artist and educator. His drawings, artist books, sculptures, and performances portray the human condition as it relates to the natural environment and inhabited spaces. He founded North Branch Projects, an organization that builds connections through book arts. He works with various communities to create crossover between disparate populations and cultures, aiming to broaden the roles of both artists and non-artists. Regin has taught at places throughout the area, such as Marwin, SAIC, and Carthage College. RISD also. He received a 3 Arts Individual Artist Award, as well as local, national, and international grants, support through artist residencies, and has exhibited internationally. He received his MFA from Rhode Island School of Design. We're extremely fortunate to hear from one of our speakers and be able to directly experience their work in person. Regin's compelling exhibition, Seven Skins, is on view in the gallery until April 26th. I encourage you all to go if you haven't already. You may also come across his interactive book stations that are part of his pedestal project, Everything on Wheels, as it travels around campus through April 23rd. Tomorrow, Regin will be hosting a community bookbinding event at Glass Curtain from 6 to 7:30. The latest I heard is that it is now at full capacity, so that's excellent. There is more information and a registration link at colum.edu/7skins. Lastly, the gallery will be hosting the Seven Skins catalog release party on Friday, April 12th from 5 to 7. All are invited to attend. Please join me in welcoming Regin Igloria to the stage.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you all for being here. It's really an honor to be exhibiting downstairs and just having the opportunity to speak with you all. I rarely get the opportunity to talk about my work, and more importantly, the work that is, I would say, encouraged to reach new modes of exploration, which is exactly what I was told a year ago when Cecilia Vargas had reached out to me about exhibiting. So I want to thank Mark, Lauren, and Meg, for all of the hard work that they do making this exhibition possible. I was really excited. I wanted to recite this whole line, "You Got Me Burning Up." I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's from the Pointer Sisters song back in 1984. But it really was an exciting opportunity. And I think what I'm going to do is just quickly go through all the pieces in the show, and then we'll talk a little bit more specifically about each of them. So as you enter the gallery, there's a wall piece, an installation piece called The Hoarding, made up of cardstock acrylic and framed directly onto the wall, 66 inches by 66 inches. And then moving directly is an installation piece that is 66 inches tall, made out of Tyvek bibs, safety pins, and painted in acrylic, covering a heat blanket or a thermal blanket. Next to that, tree reflection, also 66 by 66 inches. You'll probably hear me reciting this number and this size, and it's actually pretty significant, so we'll get to that in a minute. But this is also cardstock and acrylic mounted on a nylon banner that was printed with a digital photograph. And then a morning meditation, which is a combination of acrylic and paper collage on a traditional canvas, also 66 by 66. The only piece that isn't that size is the larger, what I call a selfie station, nylon banner piece called You Got Me Burning Up, and it includes a tripod, so it really encourages you to step in front of it and take a picture. We'll talk about that in detail, and there's a reason, of course, that it's a little bit larger than the others, mostly because I kind of think of the phone and the sort of scale that you would envision putting together a selfie as the natural way you would experience it. And then the last two pieces, Best of Seven, a Lake Michigan encounter, which is acrylic and paper collage on a nylon banner, also on a digital photo that's 66 by 66 inches. And finally, The Warmth of Moving Blankets, a big mishmash of acrylic, paper collage, and nylon banners on a traditional canvas, also 66 by 66. And in the center of the gallery is a unique sort of pedestal. I call it the heptagon pillar, which mounts 7 different artist books, one that correlates to each of the individual pieces. It's a 7-sided pillar. Talk a lot about the number 7 in a minute, but I really wanted to show all of the pieces up front just because I wanted to just share the kind of range of work that I was doing. I mean, you might see some commonalities, and I definitely feel like there are some very specific media techniques that are repeated, but it really is kind of a departure from a lot of the work that I've done in the past, mostly because I was, I think, relegated to doing a lot of sculptural and performance pieces. The spaces that I had weren't really conducive to doing larger pieces. And quite frankly, I sort of moved away from some of the things that I loved just because of the way life works and the way the contemporary art world sort of presents itself. So we'll get back to all of these pieces. I wanted to talk about this shape real quickly, the heptagon. You know, I found this on the internet because while I do a lot of sculptural woodwork, I'm not a woodworker. So you take a look at that fraction, 128 degrees and 4/7. I mean, just looking at that number and I'm like, I'm not gonna build that thing. There's no way I'm gonna get those exact measurements correct with a 51-degree angle. But it is significant because that's 7, if you think about the many ways you've seen or interpreted the number 7, I think there's a long history with traditional ideas of how it falls into place in history, and even just this idea of going through 7 skins, 7 reiterations of the actual cell work in your body over the course of every 7 years was pretty exciting to me because I grew up in a family of 7. And so very briefly, I'll introduce you to my family. You've got Ruben and Aurora, my parents, who are no longer with us, but really are the sort of the driving force behind a lot of what I'm going to talk about. My oldest sister, Maritas, who is 11 years older than me, followed by Ruben Jr., who is 10 years my senior. And then the middle child, Mila, my sister, who, interestingly enough, was sandwiched between 2 stillbirths. So there was actually kind of a gap between her and my 2 other siblings, Ronan, who is 2 years ahead of me, and then, of course, myself. So that puts us through this full shape. The reason why I really wanted to talk about my family and the number 7 is because it's always been embedded in my psyche. Thinking about the number 7, when you think of how many people are in your family, you think about experiences that you've shared and the things that you've sort of been presented with growing up. We are a relatively close family, and some fun facts here. Ruben and Ruben Jr. share the same birthday of July 10th, and I'm only 1 day apart, July 9th. And Ronan, my other brother, is just a week apart from us on the 17th. And then Aurora and Mila also share the same birthday of January 25th, with Maritas being only 1 week apart in February. So how weird is that? I mean, I don't think you can plan that even if you were that good at, all of that stuff. But I bring that up because I think there's this central idea of connectedness and this togetherness that was just undeniable. And we're a little bit weird because we're so close and we get along, all 7 of us, and we're still pretty close. But just the fact that there was that kind of bond, I feel, has sort of transcended a lot of the the distractions and the things that occur in a lifetime that maybe drive people away from each other. I talk about connectedness and connection a lot in my work because that's, I think, what I've come to realize is one of the most important things in my life. I mean, think about this, you bring home a pizza on a Saturday night or Friday night in the family, and we divide it equally. There's always one remaining slice, So there's this idea of sharing and generosity, I think, that was also embedded in my psyche. Also very important in some of the things I'm going to be talking about. I recall my sister, who was Maritas, who's the oldest, who one point, because she was the first child who was employed, bringing home a Mars bar, candy bar, and cutting it into 7 pieces so that each of us could have a little treat. I mean, who does that? It's just a little bizarre. But there are these profound sort of connections between all of us. I feel like I could spend a lifetime talking about that I keep thinking about in all the work that I do. This is a map of Albany Park, the neighborhood that I grew up in. Some of you are probably familiar with it, in the north side of Chicago. If you look closely, you could see a little label that says home number 2. That's actually where I grew up, and you'll notice that it's just about 3 blocks away from the North Branch of the Chicago River. And that big plot of green, of course, is a park. It's Labaugh Woods, Gompers Park, Eugene Field Park, all of these sort of profoundly important places that I grew up exploring. This is an intersection of a bridge in Labaugh Woods, also still around. So if you're ever up in the north side, I encourage you to explore and take a walk. But I show these because I want you to really think closely about what visual imagery is going on here. We used to, as children, play in that little plot of grass behind that bridge. We'd play baseball early in the mornings and then go exploring in the woods, mostly because we wanted to get away from the urban jungle. We wanted nature. I think that was a source of solace for us. It was a place where we could find a bit of joy from the sort of the gray and cement and sort of the traffic and bustle of the neighborhood that we grew up in Lawrence Avenue. But closely take a look as well at the graffiti. This is an interesting intersection because when I was growing up, we would find remnants of stolen cars and motorcycles and things like that discarded over that edge. There used to be a railing, but somehow they still got these vehicles thrown overboard. We used to scare ourselves silly about what we might encounter in the woods. Dead bodies, body parts found in the dirt. There was just a lot of mystery. There was a lot of the sense of exploration and joy, I think, that was so different from what we are faced with on a day-to-day basis that, even looking back at it to this day, it was just such an important piece of my upbringing. This was not, but this is an image I ripped off of a Patagonia website. Obviously, somewhere out in the wilderness, a couple of explorers with their gear and their equipment. And I'm sharing these images, including this one of this woman. I'm not even exactly sure where this is, but what a beautiful sight, seeing this surf, in this body of water. A lot of these images were so compelling to me as a child because these are things that I could only imagine. Very similar to Labaugh Woods and the North Branch River. This was nature. This is what, we were sort of called to be living in. This is the kind of space that I always felt that would elevate us in a way. Patagonia does such a great job of romanticizing nature and the wilderness. And if you were to take a bit of time researching and reading and exploring the different years of catalogs that they've put out, it's a pretty profound collection of imagery. This figure in the landscape, the figure in the mountains, particularly mountain climbers and surfers and people who, can traverse all sorts of different climates. It was just so amazingly wonderful to me. So I go back to talk about my family because we could never afford, with all 7 of us, to do these types of vacations that were portrayed in these catalogs. I could never experience these wilderness expeditions. It was all just sort of in my imagination. These catalogs like Campmore, I don't know if you're familiar with these, that came out in I think the 70s or 80s, but they were all hand-drawn bits of gear, and it was exciting for me to think about, maybe because I'm such an artist, I could employ myself by drawing some of these bits of equipment and work for Campmore. But all of these dreams, just like reaching the top of a mountain, was only realistic in this regard. That is me on top of a sort of mountain. This is actually a Schaumburg parking lot after a snowstorm. And I think you're probably familiar with the extensive shoveling and plowing that they do. It's just magnificent. But again, contextually, it was sort of the closest thing that I could get to. But eventually, as an adult, I was able to explore on my own. And I'm just sharing a couple of images quickly of my West Coast bike trip, because as an adult, it was sort of like a dream come true. I talk a lot about, camping and hiking, and I'm always a little embarrassed about how excited I am when it comes to things like that. But again, this idea of our human bodies living in this world, in this time, but living in kind of the artificiality of an urban setting was so perplexing to me. It was just really strange that we sort of conjured up a world where what you're looking at right now was not, the normal thing. It was not where we typically would exist. So I explored on my own as much as possible. And I think this image is pretty significant because the signage on the roads, this idea of road trips, this idea of mile markers or indicators of having reached certain points were very indicative of the things that I was thinking about as a human being, as a person who was going through life. And thinking about that equipment that allows me to go to those places. And think about Patagonia and REI and LL Bean and all of those sort of spaces and that world. As a Filipino brown-skinned kid, you just never saw yourself in those images. They were always of white people, young, fit folks. So that was I never really quite admitted that until I was in graduate school, but it's such an important aspect of my fraught relationship with nature, because I never felt like I belonged there because of the people I'd seen who was out there. I was relegated to, the sort of this manufactured idea of gear and equipment that would be the closest thing that I could get to the actual natural world. This is actually a Fisher-Price toy that I saw on eBay. And on my 7th birthday, I received this as a gift. And I think it was really the start of my infatuation with camping gear and outdoor gear and equipment. I'm going to fast forward quite a bit, but by the time I got to grad school, all I was doing was drawing backpacks. This is a 9-foot by 10-foot drawing that I presented as part of my graduate thesis back in 2004, titled Peak Baggage. It's graphite and acrylic on paper. This is a detail. I think this is a little bit of a better shot. But all of these bags, this is all sort of a self-portrait of my camping gear and all the equipment that I actually owned and had. But my interpretation of it was romanticized, I think, on the level that I was so familiar with in Patagonia and LL Bean and REI. It was kind of the dramatization of folds and straps and the piling on of material. My only sort of direct connection with the mountain was by drawing it. I'm drawing crevasses, I'm drawing the ripples and the waves, and that was my way of actually exploring those types of spaces. So through the drawing and through this meticulous sort of mode of methodical concentration, especially with working in graphite, it was just like I was slowly hiking up a mountain, going on a switchback back and forth, reaching thousands of feet in elevation. And hopefully in that process, finding some kind of something, I don't know, some revelation, some joy. So moving into my work, I'm fast forwarding quite a bit because there's a lot of stuff that I was doing throughout the time between graduate school, that last piece that you saw, Peak Baggage, and the work that I did in this exhibition at Glass Curtain. But I wanted to start off with this piece because I think there's a lot of relevance in some of the imagery that we are seeing in the media today. If you're familiar with G.I. Joes, it's actually taken from the graphics of these toys. These are action figures that I collected as a kid. If you grew up in the 80s, you sort of couldn't avoid these guys. And we spent all of Christmas sort of fascinated by how quickly our collection grew. And I just want you to pay attention to some of the maybe relevant correlations between some of the camping gear that I'd shown you, and some of the manufactured versions of it in these toys. Backpacks, these straps, the weapons even. I mean, I could go on and on about the story of Scarlet, the intelligence officer, and Cobra Commander, which is depicted in these two. But that graphic quality, I think, was just compelling to me. I was completely drawn to the possible history behind these characters, the idea of who these people were. If you're not familiar with G.I. Joes, they had a little card on the back that had a biography of each of them. So some of them remained mysterious, like Cobra Commander. No one knew his beginnings, but others had really great stories, kind of like the way Patagonia talked about a lot of their adventurers. And so there's this idea that there's joy maybe to be found with gear, that you need special kinds of equipment, weaponry, accessories. I think that was a big word that kind of pops up in this imagery. That was really important to me. So I moved back to that and started to play around with some of those. So these are all digital graphics manipulated, some of them featuring the original artwork of the Hasbro characters, and others a combination of some self-portraiture and other portraits or imagery of bodies and athletes and gear and equipment that I've been collecting. So if you were to stand in front of this banner piece, these are Columbia College students, so you might actually see yourselves here. This was from the opening a few weeks ago. But you could take a selfie and you could sort of imagine yourself as one of these characters. Some people really took advantage of the opportunity. This is my friend Nick, who just happens to have a graphically appropriate shirt. And my friend Sani, who really got into the sort of the gesture of the possibility, of potential of what this thing is. It is supposed to be an explosion, right? I don't know if I necessarily considered it that, because it's such a beautifully illustrated version of what fire and flames might be, and it's so stylized that once again there's an artificiality in it. And that really, I think those are the windows of opportunity that allow me as an artist to really play around and manipulate the possibilities of design and form, because ultimately that is what I'm drawn to. I mean, when I take a look at those catalogs and those brochures, I'm captivated by them because they're using design tactics that, of course, people have studied over the years to be appealing to the senses. And so as I work with these images, I'm relying on the same tactics that graphic designers would use, with color, complementary colors and shape and form relating to, meaning, playing around with some of these images that I am familiar with, some of them that I've taken, some of them that I've manipulated, and playing around with simple elements of those original designs, like the stripes of the G.I. Joe logo. This piece, Best of Seven, Lake Michigan encounter is a little bit moves off of that, but I think what I wanted to talk about in this piece is that it really was about that complete immersion in nature. I'll just share a brief story of how this image kind of came to be. For many years ago, I was a pretty avid swimmer, and there was a beautiful, crisp day in the summer, August of 2008, when I decided to go for a swim in Lake Michigan. And this is in the Lake Forest Beach up north, where I was living and working. And I decided I'd swim out to this buoy that was several hundred yards away. Well, maybe not 100 yards, but it was pretty far out into the water. And I decided that once I reached that, I was doing the breaststroke nice and calm on an absolutely perfectly clear glass-like surface where the lake had not one ripple. I would swim out and then turn around at the buoy and then do the crawl. But the minute that I did that, when I got to that turnaround point and reached this marker, my goggles shifted and they slid off my face slightly and let in a lot of water. And it completely threw me off. I was in this state of mind where, because I couldn't see where I was going, I lost the rhythm of breathing. For those of you who are swimmers, you probably relate. And I was stuck in the middle of this body of water, hundreds of yards away from the shore where no one could see me. And I panicked for some reason. And every stroke that I attempted seemed like it was getting me nowhere. And it was an unfortunate moment where I actually thought that that was it. I would be washed up on the shore of Lake Forest Beach, having lost the potential of the rest of my life because I decided to go out for a swim. And I only talk about this because, interestingly enough, I never really correlated athleticism with my art in this regard. Like the fact that I swum regularly, that I ran regularly. It was a difficult moment to consider that, this decision was life-threatening. What I don't always talk about, though, is before that moment happened, the day before, I'd actually professed my love to somebody. And it was remarkably significant, I think, that for someone like me who has a hard time doing that kind of a thing, like maybe some of you also have, it was almost as if I reached that moment, and because I was able to profess these feelings and that I was, after several months, able to express how I felt, that I could actually pass away and die. And I thought about the many years of situations like this that occurred in my life where I find these significant markers, whether they be a metaphoric buoy or just some other kind of incident that marks a separation between the past and the future, or one way of living versus another. And I came to realize that that was not going to be the last time I encountered that kind of experience. I was going to be living the rest of my life seeking these markers, seeking these moments where, you're not washed up on the shore like this. And a lot of these images are in the artist books that accompany that piece. I do a lot of work based on the water and my profound sort of relationship, especially to Lake Michigan. So moving along to the number 3 piece, the warmth of moving blankets. I was trying to incorporate some of the works that I was doing on a smaller scale, but also thinking a little bit about, I'm just showing some detail so you could kind of see the relief and texture of the piece. So there are a lot of layers of collage pieces. There are those nylon banners that were, layered on with gesso and attached using acrylics. and repainted over the surface, building up kind of, again, this mountainous sort of visual, this graphic where the parts sort of pile on and create a situation where it's almost as if you ever sweep up a mess and you create a nice little pile. I've always felt those little piles, this is really where it shows my sort of type A sense of order, but I organize things in a way that it makes for a nice pile before it hits the dustpan, and it's an interesting thing to use scraps. And I'll talk a little bit about this because it's been really important to think about all of these materials that I've been using in these pieces as just leftovers of things that already exist in my studio, things that I didn't really buy, things that are in the way, so to speak, that are just sort of creating this clutter in my life. So the moving blankets as a very symbolic material that really is something that protects and covers and allows you to move from one place to another. And those jagged lines, that rhythmic pattern that I find in moving blankets that just sort of work their way into all these images where the body and the figure are now being smothered by those blankets. The parts of a blanket are protecting and maybe providing some sort of warmth to a body or a person. And really just thinking about, again, these are all images from the artist's books, thinking about, the relationship between object and figure. You probably recognize that a lot of the tactics that I'm using still rely on those graphic design sensibilities, and the things that I was doing with that initial peak baggage piece with the straps and the exaggeration of forms was really about creating that complexity between figure and landscape. This piece is where we kind of shift. I'll be honest with you, I had a hard time with PR. It was a piece that I had sort of envisioned initially as mountainous, much bigger, a portable piece that, because they were made up of these Tyvek bibs that you would encounter or you would wear in a race event like a 5K or a marathon, could easily be stacked away. And there was sort of an impermanence in the structure. Not to mention the fact that the background, that mylar blanket, was lightweight and easily foldable and transportable in your pocket. All of these sort of ideas of material was really important to me. But this is really where that crossover between athleticism and movement and all the stuff that I do as a human being outside of making art really collide with the visual side of art making. And I really started to think about, I run so much. I participate in this culture of running. And then there's this whole other disparate world of art making and being a visual artist. And let's face it, most artists and athletes don't usually hang out with each other. But interestingly enough, I think throughout my life, I've met so many artists who are so-called athletes or runners and spend time kind of enmeshed in both worlds. So it was really an opportunity for me to think about, how can I create this crossover between those two disparate worlds that really weren't disparate at all? It was very much connected. So again, these parts, these materials like the thermal blankets, forming mountains, forming these structures that essentially are these landscapes that I've been thinking about, that I've been dreaming about, these profound moments when I explore or hike up a mountain that I never used to be able to achieve. It was so much a part of my art making process. And combining that with the mark making on the body, like a scar or a scratch, how that combines with the equipment that you wear and you use to protect those surfaces like skin. I started having a lot of fun with this, with this idea of looking back at those catalogs and thinking about shiny surfaces and things that look expensive, because I have this sort of traumatized experience of like ooh, I want that gear, but I can't afford it. And it's a really interesting way of creating some catalyst to art making. It's like I can't have it, but I can draw it. I can't buy it and I can't afford it, but I can draw it. I can romanticize the texture or pattern of this sweatshirt and turn it into something that maybe reflects weather patterns, or snow falling in a very specific way. And I could think of it as a way to really talk about that fraught relationship with this equipment and this gear. That image of the person covering their face, stems directly from a lot of the gestures that I see in magazines. And I'm just going to point out these very specific ad-like covers, magazine covers, and product endorsement pieces, because if you think about the gestures and the positions and the poses that these people have, I mean, I have to be honest with you. Like, I go out for a run and I think about what I would look like in that gear if someone were to take a picture of me. I've been on many piers like this, and I've probably held that position many times because it's just sort of it's what you do with running gear, right? I know it sounds a little silly, but I do have this profound sort of relationship with the spectacle of running and spectacle of events, and it's very similar to, I think, my experience with when I first encountered the wilderness, and you come across people who are also experiencing the wilderness. These colors, like the cones, the materials like the metal of these barrier guards separating athlete from spectator, to the gear that they're wearing, the reflective gear, and sort of the lightweight sort of materiality of that was really exciting. And I thought about spectacle. I thought about all of these elements of design that I've been so intrigued by, and I started seeing them everywhere. So that same barrier that really was about these wonderful experiences that I had in running and living this sort of lifestyle were also the same sort of elements that were found in an insurrection where people died, where there was a lot of violence. Not to mention, look at all that fluorescent yellow. I mean, that stuff is including the red, white, and blue and the stripes of the sort of the ridiculousness of patriotism. So I was really emotionally distraught by the combination of these things. I didn't like the fact that the world that I had grown to love with outdoors life, outdoors world, that culture was very similar to some of these more violent prone or sort of negative connotations of what it means to have equipment and gear. This guy, this image in particular of the insurrectionist leaping off the balcony, the minute I saw this, it took me back to my G.I. Joe days. And again, that graphic sensibility of a figure in action captured in a photograph. And I thought about Airborne, the helicopter assault trooper who was one of my favorites, codenamed Airborne. I had a little fun with this. I started writing these essays about that relationship, that fraught relationship between images of gear and equipment and people, and how they use them. And I codenamed this guy the Jason Wanna Born to be, because it's so similar to this image of Airborne traversing down with this piece of rope. Or how about the zip tie guy, who I think we all know very well, looking very similar to Snake Eyes, the commando. But I look closely at these bits of gear and these equipment, and I, again, am enthralled and sort of piqued by the shininess and the kind of the awkward fascination appeal that I have to equipment. So you look at tactical gear, you take a look at, the equipment that's used in anything that has to do with athleticism in order to accomplish a particular task or endeavor, whether it be climbing a mountain or having lightweight gear so you can, be faster. And thinking about, again, that crossover where those colors, those materials, those gestures of the figure in the landscape all starting to come together. And it really hit me hard when the Boston Marathon explosion happened, the bombings, because I was actually there running back in 2013. I'd finished about half an hour before the bombings occurred, and I was 3 blocks away. And I heard the explosions in my friend's apartment while we were waiting. So we had no idea what was going on. But this is the moment where my worlds were really kind of crumbling and colliding. I kind of felt like all of the imagery and all of the gear and the equipment and all of this sort of the experiences that I was having with this stuff was really starting to turn violent and just moving into a place that was not always about joy, was not always about finding happiness out in nature. Interestingly enough, this whole Boston Marathon bombing happened, and I could have sworn I was there, and it almost like it never happened because I was able to get on the plane before they closed the city down. There was nothing going on in the airport in terms of security by the time I left, and I had never encountered any of the mess that was going on in this scene that you see here. And I came home completely thrown off by what just occurred. And I think about how many times I traversed through different spaces. Like these are a bunch of performance walks that I'd done starting in 2006, where I sort of forced myself to move from point A to point B and to see what happens, to survive in these landscapes and to think about the imagery that I'm collecting. And I think about all of those sort of scenes that I just shared with you of things going awry and maybe things coming apart. And I think about the apocalypse a lot and the near and future. I think once again about the 80s, going back to the Reagan era and all the things that I learned as an 8-year-old kid collecting G.I. Joes, and how embedded this idea of post-apocalyptic world was just inevitable. And so these are scenes from George Miller's The Road Warrior Mad Max series, which I probably watched well over 100 times as a kid, thinking about, again, this idea of equipment, gear, mechanisms, equipment that took you out into the landscape. And it really was kind of this idea that, sure enough, I'm going to experience these moments of destruction. Tree reflection is a complete sort of turnaround, although not completely. It is about nature. It is about this sort of experience that is so unique, and about, experiencing a visual, very much like encountering a unique space in the landscape. I'm not sharing any of the images from the books because of all of the 7 books that I put together. This collection really was, I would say, random, in the sense that I gathered elements of design which was much more about sort of the pleasure and joy of seeing material rather than really thinking about the meaning behind it. This was inspired by a reflective gate that I would see making a turn on Highway 41 on a daily basis at dusk. It didn't really quite look like this, but this idea of light, the color, maybe the grid work, maybe the target that it was creating, the focal point that on a daily basis I would see. When you think about how, I don't know if many of you commute, but I do a lot of driving, maybe too much driving, and I tend to think about how many things occur during those long drives. And so again, these movements between point A and B have always been super important to me in terms of collecting imagery. We're at number 6, we're almost there. This piece, The Hoarding, is probably exemplary of a lot of the ideas I've been talking about in terms of gear and equipment, because it literally utilizes a collection of cardstock panels that are taken from, lo and behold, outdoor gear. So if you look closely at these pieces, when you get a chance to look at them downstairs, you can really see where they're coming from. But I love the idea that the abstracted forms and shapes create a different type of meaning, and that my understanding of this accumulation and this piling on of stuff is still about order. It's still about creating a sense of organization that might make sense to me. It's very similar to a lot of the equipment that I see featured online of, again, these sort of violent weaponry and accessories that have a lot more insidious sort of meanings behind them. And these sort of ways of organizing and collecting things that both people in the outdoor camping world do, as well as these militants, who just love their AR-15s. Interestingly enough, if you're also involved in the running culture, you know that before race day, everyone does a spread of their kit and shares it online. And it's just one of these things that I've been so boggled by, crossover between these worlds. And it's really kind of created this I don't want to call it a misunderstanding, but this revelation on my end where I just don't know if it's a positive or a negative thing. And maybe that's okay to not have a definitive understanding behind it. But here I am really in these last pieces showcasing how I'm organizing all of those, a combination of tactical gear and running gear and tights and shiny, bright things that are day glow, that are reflective. I mean, everywhere I go, I try to create meaning and relationships between these disparate worlds, and I try to create some significant semblance of what it means to wear these things or to own them or to move through the landscape in this material. I mean, this is my living room. I took off my raincoat, my running jacket, and I put it on this chair, and it was a beautiful moment of light, and I just had to capture it. I mean, that's the kind of life I live. I'm just loving fluorescent colors. But I think you could see the correlation between how I, in a tedious sort of way, relish the idea of flipping through Patagonia catalogs and gear catalogs and think about, the possibility of this material. And I thought I'd end with the last piece in the series, Morning Meditation, because it really takes me back to my first love, which is drawing. And this morning meditation piece is essentially just a blown up version of what I'd been doing throughout the pandemic, doing a bunch of drawings that were much smaller in scale. You can just see some of the detail work. So you can see there's collage marks, torn paper, glued and adhered together onto this piece of canvas. But again, 66 by 66 inches, which I'll get to in a minute. But I just want to show you some of the smaller scaled drawings that I'd been doing before this exhibition took place, and what I was sort of holding in during the pandemic while we all tried to figure out how to live our lives isolated and contained. This is really where it sparked my interest in just using everything that I had, not going to the store because we were relegated to not going anywhere, collaging interesting receipts and things that I just found around the home, thinking about discarded material that proved to be inspirational for a lot of the mark making that I'd been doing, and then combining it again with my relationship as a human being in nature and thinking about the figure and how those forms really create a different kind of landscape, and how those bits and parts can be swept up on a regular basis in these spaces and collected in some way. I have a thing about dust and fur because I've got a dog, and I think a lot about sort of these parts that come from the body, whether it be an animal or a human being, and then combining with the sort of slick surfaces of nylon and lightweight fabrics, creating moments of absurdity that maybe evoke some of the images that I was thinking about and experiencing through catalogs, but always indicative of this relationship with money and the way the world sort of works, putting a price tag literally on everything. So I got about another 5 minutes. I'm just going to quickly talk a little bit about North Branch Projects, which is the bookbinding community work that I do. I used to have a storefront street level space in Albany Park where I teach people how to make books as part of a community initiative to build connections. And I think you'll probably see the correlation between my interest in maintaining this kind of relationship with the people I grew up with, the people in my neighborhood, with the art world, and the things that I'd sort of experienced in art school and in the contemporary art world that we know today. So these are just a bunch of spaces where essentially I provide people materials, all free of charge. We have kind of a policy where we encourage people to make 2 books. I'll teach them how to make the books, and they can keep one, and then they give one back to us. And then we start to build this archive of handmade community effort that was really powered by individuals. And so there's something really interesting, I think, that happens at that table where people are quietly crafting away, and again, using equipment and gear and supplies, come away with something that maybe is profoundly connective in some form or another. And the bookmaking, transpired into all sorts of opportunities to teach abroad, including this elementary school in France, to a bunch of different writing centers and schools and institutions throughout this country. If you're interested in learning about a little bit more about the interactive pedestal stations, you could take a picture of that QR code. But this is sort of the way it's manifested itself in the community. It's literally gone out into the world where we bring these books to people, and they write comments and reply directly into the books, because there's something a little bit more intimate about touching and writing in a material, and not having that literal barrier preventing people from engaging or interacting with the work. So there are a lot of these images, variations of this theme of, can we collect ideas? Can we encourage people to have conversations? Can we encourage people to ask questions and form situations where people are having conversations, maybe not in a forced manner, although in these particular examples, we did ask people to share their work through this little pedestal, but to give them an opportunity to, I would say, be distracted by this idea of craft and using their hands and building things, and without them knowing it, maybe engage in a very deep or profoundly meaningful conversation with a stranger. And it's been my way of really thinking about how we've connected. And it's been super interesting to read comments and replies, because you never know what people are thinking until you ask them. So if you get a chance, please peruse through the books, see what people are saying. It's a little bit different from social media, which I think we're so used to. There's a little bit more anonymity, but there's also, I think, a lot of more vulnerability that occurs in these situations, which I think we need a lot more of. So I'll leave it at that, and I think we have enough time for some questions. Thank you all.